It is 2 in the morning somewhere in France, 1944. The artillery has gone quiet for now, which somehow makes everything worse. A rifle company is dug in along a tree line, maybe 300 men spread across a quarter-mile of cold European earth. Most of them are awake, not because they've been ordered to be. Because sleep in that situation, sleep when you don't know what's on the other side of the dark, is something your body simply refuses to do until exhaustion wins by force. And even then, it doesn't feel like sleep. It feels like a controlled collapse with your hands still on your rifle. The question of what American soldiers actually did at night during the Second World War is one of those questions that sounds simple but contains an entire universe once you start pulling on it. Not just the operations, not just the patrols and the firefights that happened after dark, the whole picture. The waiting, the rituals, the systems, the fear management, the peculiar sociology of men pressed together in the dark with nothing between them and death but distance and luck. Because nighttime in a combat zone is not simply the daytime with the lights off. It is a fundamentally different environment with different rules, different dangers, and different demands on the human mind and body. The men who learned to operate in it, who learned to read it and use it and survive it, those men developed a set of skills and habits and psychological adaptations that most of us will never need and can barely imagine. Let's start with the most basic fact about nighttime operations in World War II that most people get completely wrong. The night was not primarily a time for sleeping. This sounds obvious once you say it out loud. But the civilian mental model of military life tends to follow civilian rhythms: work during the day, rest at night. Combat doesn't work that way. In the European and Pacific theaters both, night was operationally contested terrain. Both sides understood that darkness offered concealment and both sides tried to exploit it, which meant that the hours between sundown and sunrise were among the most tactically active and psychologically demanding of the entire 24-hour cycle. The United States Army was, early in the war, behind the curve on this. American training had heavily emphasized daytime operations. When American units first encountered German forces who had spent years developing night tactics on the Eastern Front, the gap was noticeable and costly, but it closed. Through a hard experience and adaptation, American night operations became a sophisticated discipline that shaped everything from how men slept, to how they ate, to how they communicated, to how they fought. The starting point for all of it was the watch system. Every unit in a defensive position at night maintained a formal rotation of sentinels. The specifics varied by unit and by theater, but the basic structure was consistent. A fraction of the men were on watch at any given time, while the rest were theoretically resting. In a typical rifle squad, 1 or 2 men would be awake and alert while the others slept or tried to. The rotation turned over every hour or 2 hours depending on the situation. The idea was to prevent full exhaustion while maintaining a continuous human awareness of the perimeter. In practice, this was harder than it sounds. The men coming off watch were wired with residual adrenaline and couldn't always sleep. The men going on watch were often already so tired that staying genuinely alert was a physical battle. The knowledge that an attack could come at any moment, that the quiet was itself a weapon the enemy might be using to lull you, made nighttime guard duty something veterans described as one of the most draining experiences of the war. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a grinding, hours-long confrontation with your own fear and your own fatigue simultaneously. The sounds were the hardest part. Every World War II veteran memoir that touches on nighttime duty mentions the sounds. A branch breaking somewhere beyond the perimeter. Movement in the brush that might be wind, might be an animal, might be a German patrol testing the line. The mind in that state of heightened vigilance interprets everything as threat. It cannot help doing this. It is doing its job. But the job is exhausting, and it is constant, and there is no off switch. Veterans described learning to read the night over weeks and months in the field, learning which sounds were normal for a given environment, learning the difference between the way wind moves through pine trees versus the way a human body moves through underbrush. They also learned to use peripheral vision rather than direct gaze, a technique that genuinely works in low light because the rods responsible for low light vision are concentrated away from the center of the visual field. Experienced soldiers learned this the hard way in the field, often without anyone having explicitly taught them the science behind it. There was also the discipline of light. This is something that has almost no civilian equivalent today and is nearly impossible to fully internalize if you haven't lived it. In a combat zone at night, any light source is a targeting signal. A lit cigarette, visible from a considerable distance in total darkness, could draw fire. A flashlight used carelessly could illuminate a position. Even the brief orange glow of a match, something that lasts less than a second, was understood to be a potential death sentence. American soldiers adapted. Smoking, which was nearly universal among the soldier population of the 1940s, was done under shelter halves, inside sleeping bags, cupped in both hands, with the cigarette pointed downward. The glow was managed, hidden, reduced to almost nothing. Some men stopped smoking at night entirely, not out of any health consideration, but purely because the discipline required to smoke safely in total blackout conditions was more effort than it was worth when you were already managing 100 other things. Fires were essentially non-existent in forward positions after dark. Cooking happened during the day or it didn't happen at all. The K rations and C rations that American soldiers carried were specifically designed to be eaten cold, without preparation, precisely because the tactical situation often made any heat source too dangerous to risk. And yet, food was one of the central obsessions of nighttime existence, not the eating of it, though hunger was constant, but the thinking about it. Veterans across every theater described the elaborate mental menus they constructed during long night watches. What they would eat when they got home, what their mother made for Thanksgiving, the specific texture of a hamburger from a diner they used to go to on Saturday afternoons. Food fantasy was a coping mechanism, a form of psychological escape that cost nothing and required only the imagination, which was in the absence of anything else to do during 4 hours of staring into darkness, running at full capacity. Writing was another. The volume of correspondence that came out of American military units during the Second World War is staggering. Soldiers wrote letters home at every opportunity, and many of those opportunities were at night, in positions one step back from the wire. Supply depots, rear echelon billets, hospital recovery wards. The letter became the primary emotional technology of the American fighting man. It was the thread back to the world that existed before the war and presumably would exist again after it. Writing it, even knowing it would be censored, even knowing it would take weeks to arrive, was an act of psychological maintenance as much as communication. What men wrote about tells you almost as much as what they experienced. Graphic descriptions of combat are rare in those letters, partly because of censorship and partly because men did not want to make the people who loved them understand what they were actually going through. The horror was something they processed among themselves in the dark with each other, because the other major feature of nighttime in the combat zone was conversation. Low, quiet, often absurd conversation between men who had nothing to do but wait. Veterans described the conversations of the nighttime watch as some of the most honest they ever had in their lives. Something about the darkness, about the mutual vulnerability, about the shared reality of sitting in a hole in the ground somewhere in Europe or the Pacific, not knowing if they would be alive by morning, stripped away the social performances that govern most human interaction and got to something more direct. They talked about home, constantly. They talked about what they planned to do after the war with a specificity and confidence that was partly genuine planning and partly a form of magical thinking, the act of describing a future as a way of insisting it would exist. They talked about women, about family, about the bizarre civilian world where people went to movie theaters and complained about the price of gasoline, and they talked about each other, about the men in the unit, about who was reliable and who wasn't, who kept it together under fire and who came apart, these assessments made with the quiet and unsparing precision of men whose lives actually depended on the answers. The social world of the infantry squad at night was something peculiar and intense. The men knew each other in a way that few human relationships replicate outside of combat. They knew how each man breathed when he was afraid versus when he was calm. They knew who talked in his sleep and who went completely silent. They knew who would hold and who might break, and this knowledge was not theoretical. It had been tested and verified under conditions that removed all ambiguity. This social knowledge was also operationally essential. Night operations depended on it. When American units conducted nighttime patrols, which they did constantly throughout the war, the success of those operations relied almost entirely on the kind of wordless coordination that only develops between men who have spent enough time in close proximity to read each other without speaking. A nighttime patrol might go out with orders to reconnoiter a road junction, to take a prisoner for interrogation, to probe the enemy line and map its positions. They would move in near total silence for hours through terrain they could barely see, communicating by touch and by prearranged hand signals that were useless in the dark, and therefore replaced by pressure on a shoulder, a tug on a sleeve, a squeeze of the arm that meant stop, listen, danger, move. The patrol leader's job at night was one of the most technically demanding tasks in the entire war. Navigating by compass in pitch darkness through unfamiliar terrain while maintaining noise and light discipline, keeping track of men you cannot see, managing the psychological state of soldiers who can feel the weight of enemy territory around them, bringing everyone home. The men who were good at it were valued beyond almost any other skill in the infantry. And the ones who lost their patrols, who brought men home with casualties or didn't bring them home at all, carried that weight in ways that other combat experiences did not always produce. The Pacific theater added dimensions to night operations that the European theater, for all its brutality, did not replicate. Japanese doctrine explicitly embraced nighttime assault as a tactical preference. Japanese infantry units were trained to attack at night, to use darkness as a weapon, to exploit the fear and disorientation that a nighttime assault produces in ways that daytime combat simply does not. American Marines and soldiers on Guadalcanal, on Peleliu, on Iwo Jima learned this at enormous cost. The night in the Pacific was not just operationally dangerous. It was, for significant periods of those island campaigns, an environment of genuine terror in the most precise meaning of that word. Fear deployed systematically as a weapon by an enemy who understood its effects. American commanders responded by developing defensive techniques calibrated for the nighttime threat, interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery concentrations at known approach routes, tripwires connected to flares that turned night momentarily into day, passwords and countersigns designed to be difficult for non-native English speakers to pronounce, a brutal practical measure born of the reality that the alternative was worse. And through all of this, through the watches and the patrols and the artillery and the fear and the letters and the conversations in the dark, there was the fundamental biological need that the war could not eliminate entirely: sleep. The way combat soldiers actually slept during the Second World War is something that took military medicine decades to fully understand, and that civilian sleep science is still drawing lessons from. Sleep in a combat zone does not follow normal patterns. It cannot. The threat environment that prevents normal sleep is not something the brain can simply override. What happens instead is that the body and brain adapt, microsleep. Ultra-short sleep episodes of seconds to a few minutes that the brain inserts automatically into waking states when deprivation becomes critical. These episodes happen without the person's awareness. A soldier can be standing watch, eyes open, and experience a microsleep episode lasting several seconds without knowing it happened. Veterans describe waking in the middle of a firefight with no memory of having fallen asleep. Described conversations that turned out to have happened entirely in a half-sleeping state, with the other participant later reporting that they had been talking to someone who appeared awake but was demonstrably not. The brain's ability to maintain a minimal functional interface with the external world, while the deeper structures attempted to regenerate, was not a feature designed for this purpose. It was an emergency adaptation to an environment that evolution had not anticipated. What it means is that the nighttime experience of the American combat soldier in World War II was not a clean division between wakefulness and sleep. It was a continuous spectrum, a managed state of partial consciousness that stretched across the dark hours and shaped the men who lived it in ways that didn't fully reveal themselves until the war was over and the nights were supposed to be safe again. The dark that those men sat in for 4 years was not empty. It was full of threat and boredom and conversation and fear and memory and imagination, and the particular kind of clarity that comes when everything unnecessary has been stripped away, and what remains is just you, the man next to you, the rifle in your hands, and the night pressing in from every direction. They sat in it, they learned it, they came home from it, and most of them never fully left it.